Right. So, building a pond, and this is what this is about. This picture, which is so cute, I think, is of a pond in a school that we was created. It was dug, and the whole garden in the school is a wildlife garden that was designed by Permablitz London, and these kids were filling it up with tiny little watering cans from a water butt, as well as the hose. So I'll come back to that anyway. So this is how the workshop is going to be structured. It's going to consist of, I'm going to start by talking about the benefits of ponds, and then look at how to approach building a pond. And there are lots of different ways in which you could create a pond. So I'm going to hopefully cover all those different methods, or a number of different methods. I won't cover all, but I'll cover a number. And then I'm going to talk about the plants that you would put in your pond, the different types of plants you can put in a pond, and then talk about how you can keep your pond healthy as well, okay? And there will be questions. So I think probably the best thing is, if you've got a question, there's not lots of people in the workshop. So if you've got a question as we're going along, probably just, you know, unmute yourself and shout out. And if not, there is going to be space for questions at the end anyway. So, you know, don't worry too much if you miss your chance. So the benefits of a pond, they reckon that in London, 90% of the ponds that existed back at the turn of the 1900s, so 90% of those ponds have gone. So there's been a massive reduction in the number of ponds, I think not just in London, but actually across the whole country as well. And so really, because the countryside has changed and become much more industrialized, and obviously the whole kind of what is here in London, a lot of people have gardens, but a lot of people don't have ponds in their gardens. So there's a lot of ponds that have been lost. And they're really crucial, because they kind of benefit, I suppose you could almost say, almost all type of wildlife. I mean, because they provide drinking water for sort of birds, bats, small mammals, but also for insects like bees and wasps and butterflies and so on. And you forget that in fact those creatures need to drink as well. I mean, on my allotment, I've seen a small sort of pond that's kind of really turned into almost a mud, you know, very, very muddy, but still has water in it. I've seen that absolutely covered in bees, all drinking from the water. So that is a really important resource for insects. Then you've also got all the amphibians, which we've talked about, and there's space for one in Yogi's garden, one frog. But obviously you've got newts, frogs and toads. And in fact, they live a lot of their life out of water. They spend most of their life out of water. They don't really live in the water. They come back to the pond to breed. And I mean, I've seen them in there in the summer, but you're more likely to find them in a kind of dark, shady place, like under a rock or behind some wood, you know, somewhere where it's still going to remain damp, but certainly they'll stay out of the light during the day and then generally come out at night. So without a pond, obviously they can't breed. And as people have already said, having frogs and toads who eat slugs, that's really handy in a garden if you want to grow things that slugs like to eat. The planting, you know, the plants that you put in the pond, they will provide nectar and pollen for insects. And they can, if you've got a large enough pond, this is less likely for a smaller pond because the smaller pond won't create enough of an ecosystem, but a larger pond could create a habitat for loads of other insects, including dragonflies, caddisflies, stoneflies, mayflies, and you know, lots of others. And what you've got to remember is those insects provide really crucial food for birds and bats and so on. So, you know, that's really important as well. So in terms of how to approach building a pond, I suppose really I should have called this how to approach planning for your pond, really, because I wanted to start by saying you can have ponds of very different sizes. And so I've got a very small container, picture of a very small container pond here. And then this is also a very small pond that's been dug into the ground, you know, a very tiny pond dug into the ground. So those are very small. And then obviously this is a picture of a larger pond. So really they can vary quite a lot in size. And although you won't have a huge ecosystem in a small pond, you will still provide habitat and will still benefit wildlife, regardless of the size. So you can obviously, given you've just seen the ponds, you know, the varying ponds that I've shown you, you can use different materials to create the pond. And the most common material people probably use is a liner. And that's where essentially you dig a hole and then you put down some underlay and then put in a waterproof liner. And that's then to hold the water. We have been talking about earlier, you know, creating a kind of puddling the clay and getting the clay to really, you know, if you're in a very strongly clay area and you take off the topsoil, you would come to a layer of clay that you probably could set up so that it would be waterproof, it would hold the water, but it's not absolutely guaranteed. And you don't really want a pond where the water's constantly seeping out. You want something that's going to be fairly stable. So yes, there's a liner. You could also get a preformed structure, generally fiberglass, and you can see that this is such a kind of preformed structure. And those are easy to install. You just have to dig a hole to match the shape. They're generally quite expensive and they don't have much flexibility. You know, you get the shape you buy and that's it, basically. You can't adjust it. Whereas you can see immediately that with a liner, then you've got the flexibility to create the shape that you want, rather than being stuck with a particular shape. So having a container is a really fantastic way to create a small pond in a small garden, well, even in a large garden, actually, in a very straightforward way. So a pot without holes or a barrel, half barrel, as you can see on the right, both those can provide, or a sink, as you're talking about using a Larry. You know, there are lots of different structures, or maybe Rish is going to try a wheelbarrow. That'll be interesting. You know, so there are lots of different structures that you could also use to create a fairly straightforward pond. They're cheap, generally. It's a cheap and straightforward way to set up a pond. You do need to bear in mind that you want to create a way for wildlife to be able to access the water, depending on what wildlife, you know, you want. But they're also, the other benefit is they're generally safer for smaller children, because they can't fall in them. They're much, you know, they might climb up into them, but you can also set things up so that it's hard to access them. You know, for very small toddlers who are most at risk from a pond, you know, they will find it hard to get into it. If it's hard to get into it, then they're less likely to manage to do that. So I want to start having sort of, those are your options, or those are three possible options. Let's say a container, using liner, using a preformed structure, and then using a container, okay, you know, an existing container with no holes. So those are your three possible options that I'm going to look at tonight. The preformed option.
Susannah,
yes.
Before you go on to the next bit, can
Yes.
I ask about whereabouts, is there any particular beneficial place within the garden, in shade or in sun, or?
Yes, that's a really good question, actually. It does need to be in sun, or it needs to be partially in sun. The pond doesn't do well in shade. And you've also got to consider that if it's underneath a tree, then if it's a deciduous tree, then all the leaves will fall into the pond, which is not ideal either. So generally speaking, you want a sunny spot. And when I say a sunny spot, it doesn't have to have sun all day. So this pond on the right here, this is in I would say it's probably is full sun, because it probably does get sun for maybe 4 hours. But it's not, it does also have part of the day where it's probably in shade. It won't have sun directly on it, but you can see it's thriving, it's doing really well. Is that okay? That's a really good question there, Gillian. Thank you. I should have added that in. So in terms of approaching digging a pond out using a liner, I'm just going to start by having a look at this, at how you go about using doing this. And the first thing to understand is that you need to, when you're creating a pond, you generally need to create a pond with different levels. Okay, so you create a pond with shelving. And so what you can see here is you've got the deepest part of the pond, which is actually quite a relatively small area proportionally to the rest of the pond. Okay, and that is going to be 45 centimeters plus, 18 inches plus, roughly. Doesn't have to be any deeper than that. I mean, the maximum depth really that you want is 1 meter, generally speaking. As you can see, it's not a huge part of the pond that is that depth. And then what you've got are shelves going around the outside, which are also at different depths. And that's because different plants in a pond like to live at different depths. So some like just their roots in the water. They like to have all their greenery outside the water, or have their roots partially in the water. And then some like to have their roots and more of their actual top part of the plant in water. And then you have things like water lilies, which really like to be right down in the, you know, they root and grow in the depths of the pond. Okay. You'll also notice here that you've got an area which is labeled waterlogged soil. And that's where you can create a boggy area. And that boggy area doesn't actually, it's wet. So you can put a pond liner underneath some soil so that it generally will stay wet, but it's not waterlogged. It's not just water. So it's basically very, very wet soil, like a bog. And then there are plants that like to live in those kind of conditions as well. The other thing you'll also notice, which I'll come on to, is that there's a sloping area. I think there's a sloping area here. There's also a bit more of a sloping area there, I think. So you've also got to consider how, you know, how wildlife might get in. So I'll come back to that and talk a bit more about that. So that's the kind of bottom line. You're going to be considering, you know, your pond from that point of view. There are different types of liner. I haven't listed them all here, but the best that I've used and had recommended is the trilaminate LDPE, which is an extremely tough liner. It's cheap and non-toxic, obviously. And so that's a really good solution for a liner, because otherwise it does get surprisingly expensive. And then this is the liner that most people would have used in the past, I guess. Butyl rubber liner is one, you know, is another option. There is also the option to use something called bentonite clay. And that sounds like a very good option, but is both expensive and I think quite hard to install. I've not installed a pond with bentonite clay. I think it's really designed for larger ponds. And the idea is that you're using a completely natural material, the bentonite clay. And that's kind of a bit like, you know, well, it's a clay, so then it acts as a kind of waterproof container. So you'll also need a pond liner underlay. And this is basically something that's going to protect the liner from any stones or thorns or twigs or whatever, anything like that that's, you know, in danger of actually sticking into the liner. You could use, there are a number of different things you can use. You can use carpet underlay or even a wool carpet, you know, offcuts of wool carpet. Obviously the underlay doesn't have to be in one piece. It can be a number, you know, different sections. It's the, it's really the it's the pond liner itself that needs to be all in one piece. And you can also buy pond liner underlay, and you know that's reasonably cheap, and you can just buy it in sort of I think it's, I mean, I've bought it before in kind of a bit like buying material really, where you buy it at 2 meters wide in a certain number of lengths of meters. You know, it can vary how wide it's going to be, so you can kind of adjust that as you want. So that's the pond liner underlay. Now, insofar as you're then planning the shape of your pond, and that's really the benefit of creating a pond using liner, is that you can decide how you want to shape it. And it's just that it's worth bearing in mind that, as I was saying, you need a sloping side. You know, you need an area where the ground slopes into the pond, or that where there are steps for wildlife to get in. And I mean, this is not really relevant to the shape of your pond actually, but you also, this is one of the benefits of having plants emerging from the water, is that then the insects can, you know, get in and out, or get out mainly. So this is a dragonfly emerging from a dragonfly larvae on something like an iris, I think. So they have to have that. That's where the larvae go and attach themselves, connect themselves with a bit of silk to a leaf, and then transform themselves into dragonflies, for example. So you'll also need that. But I wanted to show you this picture because this is where you can see the pond here. This pond here really just has a very, very shallow slope going into the pond. And that's ideal for wildlife. You know, it's ideal for mammals to come and have a drink. Makes life, you know, makes it a lot easier for them to come up and actually use the pond and approach the pond. So as I was saying, pond plants need to live on different levels. And so if you're digging a pond out, you'll need to create shelves around the edge for what are known as marginal plants. I'm going to explain more about the plants a bit later on. So I'll be coming back to that, but this is a cross section, which is really referring back to this picture here, which where we're looking at some, you know, a pond that's already been dug out and structured, but from above. Okay, so this is really looking at the same idea where you've got your deep marginals, your more shallow marginals, and then your very deep plants in the middle. And this kind of illustration is really one of how you could structure your pond as a cross section. So you will need a deeper area of water also for winter shelter. So you ideally want to have an area in the center that's 45 centimeters or more deep. You don't want to make it too deep, as I've already said, no more than 1 meter generally. Most of the pond plants don't thrive in deep water, so you just want to avoid that really. Once you've dug out your pond, it's important to make sure that your pond is level. It's going to look really, well, you'll see all the liner otherwise. You know, if it's not level on one side, you'll see that the liner's all there. And this is one way to make sure that your pond is level all the way around, essentially creating a kind of a stake in the middle of the pond, and then you have a stick that, you know, a piece of timber that stretches beyond the stake to the edge, and then you use a spirit level just to check that around the edge everything is level. So that should help you to dig a pond and make sure that it's level. So once you've done that, then it's also worth thinking about what kind of edging you want around your pond. And so you can see here, this is actually the same pond. What happens repeatedly to these stones, I have to say, is they get knocked into the pond. I think it's probably by foxes or pigeons or somebody, but you can see what happens if they aren't around the edge of the pond is the pond liner shows. And so you want to choose something. It's generally people use stones of some sort. Here's another example with rocks that have been put, you've got kind of pebbles and rocks, a mixture of pebbles and rocks around the edge of the pond, and that is really useful just to cover up the pond liner. So you need to think about what kind of edging you want to use. And then once you've done that, really, once you've dug the hole, it's then a question of covering the base with underlay and then putting the pond liner in. And we're really back to the picture at the beginning, which is once you've laid the pond liner in, it's the next step is to start filling with water. And what you find is that then the pond liner will take on the form and shape of the hole that you've dug as you fill it with water. That's what's going to cause it to do that. So that would be the next, that would be how you would then end up with a pond that has, that you've created using the liner. So I'll just stop there. Has anyone got any questions on that? Just for a moment. No? Doesn't sound like it, so I'll carry on in that case. So I just wanted to look at using a half barrel, for example. And half barrels are great, I think, for ponds, and they're really quite cheap. So you can buy a half barrel for between 40 and 60 pounds. You pay a bit extra for it to be delivered, but they're a relatively cheap way to establish a pond. They're also recycled, so it's good from that point of view because you're essentially recycling a barrel. However, there are some things you need to consider. So when you get a half barrel, it's usually had wine or whiskey or something like that in it, and it's still extremely whiffy. And of course, all the wine and the whiskey is soaked into the wood. So I would really strongly recommend soaking for several days and repeatedly replacing the water in order to reduce the amount of alcohol in the barrel. It does become quite whiffy. So that's definitely worth considering before you start with that. And then in terms of a barrel, obviously you can't dig in shelves, but you can use bricks to create shelves or different levels in your container. And you can see with this barrel pond here, half barrel pond here, we've also used bricks to create steps for wildlife to get in and out as well. And you can see this pond basket here, the water level's a little bit low there, but that is actually sitting on bricks as well inside the pond, so that it's raised from the base of the barrel. So filling up your pond, and obviously the first thing that you need to bear in mind is you need non-chlorinated water. So the ideal for that is rainwater, but you'd have to have quite a lot of rainwater collected. So if you have got several water butts, that would be great. But as an alternative, you can also use a dechlorinator. This is a picture of a dechlorinator. It's available from Aquatiere, and it's about £30 on Amazon. So it's a relatively affordable device, and you can see it just plugs into a hose, so it's really handy. And we use one of these a lot in the gardens that I take care of, because it means that every time if you do water using a hose, you're not killing the bacteria, because it's removing the chlorine from the water before it goes into the ground. So it has a double, it has multiple uses, I would say. It just means that, because obviously the chlorine will kill the microbes, bacterial microbes in the ground. So it's handy from that point of view. It's also very useful if you've got a pond, and particularly useful if you've got a pond which needs to be replenished because we're having days of heat of 30+ degrees. The other alternative, though, if you don't want to buy a dechlorinator, which would also be understandable, is that you can fill your pond and then leave it for a few days before adding the plants, and you'll find that the chlorine will evaporate over time. So you could also, if you don't have any other options, that's another thing that you can also do as well. So, any questions at this point? It sounds like not. No? Okay. So that's what I want to move on to talk about now, are plants for your pond. And how you would go about, how you understand how you would plant up your pond. So the plants are obviously crucial, and they are really what's going to create the ecosystem in your pond. So if you just put in a half barrel in your garden, fill it with dechlorinated water, and then just leave it, not a lot's going to happen. In fact, probably nothing except a lot of mosquito larvae will start to live in it, and that would still probably be useful. Probably not for you because you'd be bitten by lots of mosquitoes, but you know, swifts and bats, and if you've got any swallows, they'd certainly be eating them. So you know, it's when I say nothing would happen, that's not entirely true, because obviously you would have mosquitoes growing there, but really the plants are going to provide and create much more of an ecosystem. And so what I want to explain is that there are ponds which play different roles in a pond, plants that play different roles in a pond. I'm not sure what I just said there. And they like to be positioned in different parts of the pond in order to play those roles. So the first type role of plant that I'm going to talk about are oxygenators, and they are generally submerged, and they kind of just float usually in the water, and they're called oxygenators because they feed on carbon dioxide and absorb minerals, and they create a much more oxygenated environment in the pond, which is what you want generally. It means that the pond is less conducive to algae, and you'll need about 2 bunches of oxygenators per square meter of pond. Okay, and I'll come on to talk about some of the oxygenators shortly. Then there are floaters. These are ponds that float in the water. They aren't attached to the bottom, and they cover the surface of the pond, or a portion of the surface of the pond. And ideally, you want to have about 50 to 60% of your pond surface covered. And that's because it creates an insulation so that the pond isn't so subject to the variations in temperature. You know, it doesn't get so hot, doesn't get so cold, and so on. And it also provides good cover for wildlife as well, so they can live underneath the leaves. And so there are various different floaters that you can use. Marginal plants, they live at different depths on the margins. I've already mentioned those, and they basically, the main benefit to wildlife that they provide is that they provide a way in and out of the pond for a lot of insects. And so if you've got a larger pond, as I was saying, you know, and you're lucky enough to have something like dragonflies or mayflies or whatever, they go into the pond. The insects lay their eggs from the leaves of plants, and then they come out, you know, the larvae come out, and you know, the flies emerge, or insects emerge from the pond up the leaves as well. So they're important from that point of view. But the flowers also provide nectar and pollen for insects, bees, butterflies, hoverflies. They're all contributes to the nectar and pollen that's available for those insects in your garden. Water lilies, there are a lot of different varieties of water lilies, so it's really important to understand that, because they can be huge. They're planted at the bottom of the pond at the deepest level generally, and the leaves cover the surface, so they benefit the pond. They're one way of creating shade within the pond, you know, where you've got leaves that cover the surface, keep the temperature down during the summer, and make the algae blooms less likely. But you get lots of different sizes. There are water lilies that are, you know, miniature pygmy water lilies. You know, if you've got a container for a pond, there are some really, really tiny, beautiful, dinky little water lilies that you can choose from. So here are a couple of oxygenators. These are both native to Britain. I mean, not that I don't think that particularly matters, but these are 2 really excellent oxygenators, and you just put them in the pond, and they just float around and grow pretty much. Hornwort, you can see, is sort of a bit more planted, but the spiked milfoil will just float around in the water. Then you've got these floaters. So you've got frogbit on the left. That's great, and bogbean is also really good as well. Both of them have flowers which are great. And what you have got to consider is how big your pond is, because obviously, you know, to use either of these plants, if you're going to have a water lily as well, it means you've really got to have a fair amount of space for them to spread and cover the water. but they both create a good habitat for insects and create good cover for the surface of your pond. There are loads of marginals. I mean, you could spend hours going through the different marginal plants that might, to choose from. Marsh marigold on the left here, this with the beautiful yellow flowers, that's fantastic. Creates huge amounts of greenery and loads of flowers in March to May, which are great for early nectar feeders for the insects. You've got this flowering rush, and again you can see this has got the leaves coming out of the water, which are great for wildlife and insects to move in between, inside the water and coming out again. Lovely flowers, really pretty flowers, really pretty plant, really great for ponds, I would say. And cotton grass, another good marginal plant. And I mean, I really like these kind of feathery seed heads. I think they're great. So I'm quite keen on that one. Hemp agrimony, that's a plant, that's a big plant. You'll see that growing along the sides of rivers sometimes. Fantastic. I mean, it's one of the top plants, I think, for bees and butterflies, really loved by bees and butterflies, but it is a big plant. So if you've got a decent sized pond, that would be great. Yellow flag iris, again, often put into a pond that's really too small to contain it. It likes to have space. So it wouldn't be suitable for a small pond, but for a larger pond, it'd be great. Again, it spreads, it's got these spiky kind of style leaves, which means that insects can get in and out. So really, fantastic for insects in the pond. And then obviously you've also got the flowers as well. Purple loosestrife is a common plant that you'll see growing along the edges of waterways. Really good, again, provides nectar for bees and butterflies. Very attractive, very pretty plant as well, with lovely purple flowers. So that's also a good option. Water spearmint is one of my favorites. That's a really lovely smell, really nice smell. And just like most of the mint family, the flowers are fantastic. They love, bees and butterflies love them. And then forget-me-nots, they're great for, again, they'll create a good habitat. Newts particularly like the leaves to lay eggs onto. Also uses lots of nutrients, so it'll discourage algae as well. So that's useful. And then brook lime, that's also creates quite a lot of foliage, so it's good for, provides good cover for newts and tadpoles. Again, uses lots of nutrients as well. So that's also another plant that's worth considering. And then finally, water lilies. I mean, this is one particular water lily, absolutely beautiful. But what you'll find when you're looking for water lilies is that there are lots of different sizes. And as I say, you want, you can choose, if you've only got a small pond, you can just choose a very small one. It's also worth checking what kind of depth they need. So for you, Larry, where you want to, you're using a sink, it might be that that's too shallow for all water lilies, but it's just a question of checking, double checking. And if it were, then you would just go for a different floater, one of these floaters, maybe frogbit, for example. So that's...
Susannah, if I have a pond that's going to be about just over 2 meters in diameter, and I think the maximum depth I'm looking for at the moment is about 24 inches. And I really want like a Monet style lily pond. So
right.
What would you recommend I put in there?
Well, I would recommend making the center depth 24 inches, did you say? That should be fine.
I was thinking about 24. I could stretch to 30, but I think 24 is probably
that should
okay.
Be fine. Yeah. I mean, that'll be fine. The water lilies will spread. I mean, you'd only need to put in, if it's 2 meters diameter, again, you'd look at different varieties of water lily and how much, what kind of spread they'd give you. And you might only have one, might well only have one water lily for the whole pond.
Everybody has told me that I only need one water lily.
Yeah,
It will come.
exactly. I mean, I guess you possibly could have two if you want different variety, if you want different coloured flowers,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but then what you'd be doing is kind of, you'd probably have to kind of pull them out every couple of years and, you know, hack them back, you know, divide them so that they don't take over the pond. Because you don't want the whole pond covered,
No.
you know, with water lilies. I mean, I know Monet's ponds are pretty much covered in water lilies, so.
It's a huge pond.
Huh?
It's a huge pond, Monet's pond.
It is, yes, exactly. So, yeah. So then there are plants to avoid. Okay, so most of these, I don't think you'll find them around much. This one I actually have seen this water fern in a garden centre in a pond where they were selling pond plants, but that was several years ago now. It's a nightmare to get rid of if you end up with water fern, and so it's now been banned, you know, for people to use. This is parrot's feather. That's also banned, and so is water primrose. So it's unlikely you'll come across these. You won't be able to buy them. It's more likely that you might pick them up from somebody else's pond. You know, if someone says to you, "Oh, look, you know, I've got a plant here, I can help you out and, you know, give you some of it." It's just worth bearing in mind you don't want any of these, and you don't want any plants from a pond which has any water fern, because you will immediately introduce water fern in all likelihood into your pond. So you want to double check that nobody's, you know, you're not kind of going to contaminate with that. Australian swamp stonecrop, again, I haven't come across this myself, but it is around. And this one we used to use all the time, pearly pondweed, but that's now been banned as well, because I think with all of these, it's really because they are, they grow very vigorously, and I think they're concerned about them going into the wild waterways and so on. And to be honest, I don't know the ins and outs of that. I don't know to what extent there's a kind of, they're taking over, kind of slightly over the top kind of concern. But the long and the short of it is they have been banned. You won't be able to buy them. Probably best, you know, to try and avoid them in any pond you've got. So when you're adding your pond plants, they're planted up quite differently to regular plants. Okay, so the first thing is they're put into baskets. So this is generally what you would put your pond plants into, is something like a pond basket. And you get different sizes, different shapes. You know, they can be square or rectangular or round, you know, circular. And the point of the holes is really so that the water can circulate, get in very easily into the soil, and also so that roots can grow through the holes. Okay, so the roots aren't confined to the basket. They grow out through the basket, and that's the whole point of them having these holes as well. And then you don't use regular plant compost either. Okay, so not a multi-purpose compost. That's the last thing you want to do, because a lot of them contain peat, and then they start breaking down and, you know, decomposing in the pond, which is just going to play havoc with your ecosystem. So generally speaking, you can use a medium or heavy loam or a clay soil. So you could use garden soil if it's suitable. Otherwise, you can use a specialist aquatic compost. And I've used this stuff before. It's been great. You know, I've been perfectly, really good. And what you're looking for, therefore, is a soil that's going to be really a bit lighter in colour. You know, so you don't want a really dark soil. You want a soil that's going to be more brown. And that brown is indicative of having more clay in the soil. And basically that holds the plant in place. You know, the clay will hold the plant in place. So here are some pictures of potting up the pond plants. And when you buy pond plants, you can buy them two ways. You can either buy them already planted up in their pots. Obviously, that's going to be a lot more expensive. And this is one thing that's worth bearing in mind, because when you go online, you can often see, you know, you'll see that pond plants will vary drastically in price. And you may not realize that that's because you can buy pond plants that aren't potted up, and you can buy pond plants that are. And that's a big difference. You know, that'll be a big difference in price. The advantage of buying pond plants that are already potted up is that they will already have grown, their roots will have grown into the pot, making them much more stable when you actually put them in the pond. It makes it much more likely that they're not just going to float out of the pot. But having said that, I mean, as you can see here, this is a permablitz where we were potting up pond plants at the permablitz, and they were fine. That all worked fine. So especially if you've got the right soil, we were just using this aquatic compost. It's quite heavy. So really, by the time, as long as you've firmly planted put the plants in, then that'll work fine. You know, I haven't had any problems with that, but it is worth bearing that in mind. Also got to bear in mind that if you're ordering plants over the internet, if you want them potted up, that's going to be a much bigger expense for delivery. Then you can see here, these are how the pond plants arrive. They just arrive in plastic bags, basically. So it's much cheaper to, delivery is much cheaper. Okay. And there's the plants potted up, and they've just been placed around the edge of this pond as marginal plants. And you can see this was done in spring. And so it's also worth bearing in mind that the plants are generally deciduous and they go dormant over winter. So you won't have any, you know, plant life around the pond usually in winter. And when you buy the pond plants, therefore, they don't sell them until there's something, you know, that it looks like you've actually got a plant. Okay, so, you know, you'll find that you won't really be able to buy them until spring when they've started growing again, because the companies just, you know, they'll just get loads of complaints where they go, there's no plant here, you know, because people don't necessarily understand that the plant doesn't start growing until, you know, later on in spring. Okay. So any questions on plants and planting up your pond? Doesn't sound like it. So there are a couple of places where online, which I would really recommend going to if you're planning your pond. They have excellent information about pond plants and generally excellent information about ponds. And both of them, if you phone them, will give you really good advice about which plants would be suitable for your pond. One is Meerbrook Pond Plants, and the other is Waterside. I think it's called Waterside Pond Plants. I think Waterside Pond Plants regularly have a win medals at Chelsea. But they're both really helpful in my experience and really useful because they're very, they're also very kind of high and mighty about people who choose the wrong pond plants, you know, and choose plants that just are totally unsuitable for the size of ponds that they're, you know, they've got. So I think those two places are definitely worth going to see. The compost, I have bought this aquatic compost I've got from Homebase before. Definitely worth seeing if you can get it locally, obviously, if you do want to use that. And both, I haven't really seen these pond plant baskets sold. You might find them in a local garden centre, but otherwise Meerbrook plants or Waterside plants, they're not actually too bad to have delivered because they're very light. So you can certainly buy those online as well. The other thing just to say actually, which they will also advise you, is only to put one variety of plant in, one type of plant in each basket. Doesn't mean you only put one plant in each basket. You might put, say, 3 or 4. If you've got a large rectangular baskets, these baskets are quite big. If you've got a large, you know, some water mint, you might put in 3 or 4 plants. You might put in a plant in each corner. But if you put in, say, water hyacinth and water mint into the same plant pot, one will probably dominate, so you'll lose the other. So that's why it's sensible really to stick with one type of plant in each pot. So they can't do that. One hopes they won't do that. So moving on to keeping your pond healthy. The smaller the pond, the more challenging that is, generally speaking, partly because what tends to happen is that the water dries out, and you can see there have been some pictures of ponds which need filling up. You know, the water does dry out quite easily, especially in this weather, especially if your pond is above the surface, so in a barrel, for example. So you may well find that you need to keep regularly refilling, especially in London. You know, we've had weeks where we've had no rain, you know, as you know. But one of the things that you can do, these are some things you can do to keep really to keep the ecosystem healthy and avoid things like blanket weed and algae and so on. So adding pea gravel to the pond really increases the surface area, and that improves the habitat for beneficial bacteria. So it's really useful to add some pea gravel. Be careful though, because there's a lot of gravel you buy which will be essentially, from a pond point of view, contaminated with salts. And so what you want is, you can buy a gravel called horticultural gravel, which is basically, it's ready for ponds and using in the garden, and you know, is not going to cause any problems in the pond. So that's ideal to put in a load of that kind of gravel. And then there's a product called EM balls. These are great. They're called EM mud balls, I think, but they're basically balls that contain a mix of bokashi, wheat bran, clay, microbes, and ceramic powder. And basically they seem to balance out the microbial sort of ecosystem in the pond. And so they avoid, it means the pond is reasonably clear and generally fairly healthy. So those are really good. Those are available from Harrod Horticultural. And I think you get 4 balls for about £24. And you put in one every couple of months or so. So 4 balls would probably keep you going pretty much for a year, because you'd really only use them in the kind of summer months. And then Symbio, who produce our much loved Ecto Whip Dip that we use when we're putting in plant in the garden, they produce a product called Blue Water, and that helps to prevent algae blooms as well. So it's basically a way of reducing nitrates and phosphates, and that's also very good. I mean, if you wanted to really kind of do the best job you could use both Symbio Blue Water and EM mud balls. With the Symbio Blue Water, I think you put in like a scoop once every, or certain number of scoops depending on the size of your pond, once every 6 weeks or so. So those are all options. There's also, you can buy things like barley straw, but I have to say these things are the things that I've found most effective. The EM mud balls in particular, I found really helpful. So that brings us on to any questions.
That was very informative. I started digging a pond, right? I didn't really research enough, but today I feel I have a lot of information that I probably need.
Oh, okay, good.
That's cool.
Good.
I have one concern, because where I'm digging the pond, there is a huge poplar, and there is some roots from the poplar. I think we'll dig out as many as possible. And this is why, in the first instance, I wanted to puddle the pond, right, so that it doesn't grow through the liner. So. And
are you using you're using a underlay, are you, of some sort?
If I put a liner, I will use an underlay, yes.
An underlay, yes. I mean, what you could try doing is, where on the side where the poplar is, you could try getting some wool carpet and use that as an underlay, because that's really, you know, that would be harder for the roots to grow through at any rate.
Okay. Yeah.
But also remember Gillen's really good question about where to position your ponds is, I mean, poplars are very tall. They don't really cast a lot of shade. But just bear in mind that you don't want shade, and ideally you don't want leaves either.
No, it is going to be almost in full sun, but because of the poplar, I might actually put some mesh in autumn so
Right,
that the
yeah.
leaves don't fall in.
Catch the leaves.
I mean, I hope all of you visit my garden one day, because where the pond is situated, about diagonally across, I have built like a Japanese tea house.
Whoa, that
It's
sounds so cool.
it's looking directly where you sit there. It's literally a bench kind of thing with a roof, and I've got a lot of acers next to it, but it is positioned such that when you are sitting, you get the breeze from the poplar, and hopefully you'll be looking onto the lilies.
Wow, that sounds lovely. I think that's going to be an outing for the community garden, isn't it, to come and have a cup of tea?
We'll have Japanese tea.
Yeah, Japanese tea. That sounds really cool. Excellent. Has
And
anyone
I'm not far from, I live where the Northwick Circle is, just off the circle. So it's literally about, maybe from Northwick Park Station, about 7 minutes walk maximum.
Okay, cool. That's brilliant. So once lockdown's finished, we'll be round.
Well, we can do social distancing in the lockdown too.
Yes, that's probably, yeah, cool. Has anyone else got any questions? No? So I'm hoping that is an indication that I've, oh, there's Yogi. How to avoid more than one frog joining your pond. Is that your question?
Hi, just wanted to ask, I mean, mine's going to be completely opposite. It's very small. As I said, it's probably, I've got this plastic tray, about a metre or so long and about 15 inches wide, with only about 3 inches or so deep. I've done one. I might add a second one to it. But
3 inches, did you say?
But sorry?
You say 3 inches?
About 3 inches deep, yes.
Okay.
I might add another tray. So I don't want to make it too big, because I've got 4 grandchildren and they're fairly young.
Right.
So I don't want to make it too big.
Yeah.
But could I use a pump to turn the water around and
I don't know. I don't know if you'd be able
aerate
to,
it.
Yeah, to aerate the water. I don't know if it'll work in 3 inches of water.
Right.
You know, I mean, you could certainly have a look.
Okay.
But that's kind of why you use the oxygenating plants.
That's what I saw that. Sorry, I had to pop out, sort out my car for a couple of minutes, so I missed a little bit. But I did see something about, the oxygenators, and you mentioned something about, called.
I mean, I think in a pond that's that shallow, all you're going to be able to put in are some marginal plants and some oxygenators. So you'll have the the marginal plants that are happy near the surface.
Yes,
kind of
that's what I was thinking of doing. Water lilies and floaters probably a no-no.
They're definitely a no-no.
Yeah. Okay.
If you've only got 3 inches of depth,
Yeah. I mean, maybe at a later date, when the kids have grown up a bit more,
older,
I might get someone to dig a bigger hole for me, because I'll probably just be too old and to dig all that much.
Or maybe have a permablitz.
Yes, well, there's that as well. But,
there is that as well as a possibility.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Yogi. Anybody else?
Maybe just following on from that if you're only having a little pond, what's the essential one? Just the oxygenators, and then choose from.
No, I mean, it depends how little. I mean, let me just, I'll just share the screen again, because there is, let's just go back. I mean, even in a very small pond, you can still actually put in quite a lot. So, I mean, this is there. You see, this is a little barrel pond. So this is a little boy, believe it or not. And And what you've got in here, nonetheless, I think is an absolutely minuscule little water lily. And then you've got some bricks, which just means that then you've got a couple of marginal plants, a few marginal plants around the edge as well.
Yeah.
And then you'll have oxygenators inside as well. And the water lily will basically cover the surface.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so.
I mean, I'm not sure what size you're kind of going for.
I like the idea of a water barrel, to be honest, or something that size.
Yeah.
A small sunken, half sunken.
Yeah. No, I think they're really pretty.
You can even use an old water tank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you know, you find water tanks that are being thrown out, old plastic ones, so that would work as well.
Yeah.
I was just thinking the same thing. We just had our old water tanks taken out of our loft. They were old metal ones, actually, but unfortunately we got them outside the house, and actually a friend was going to have them for his allotment, but somebody stole them. So,
Oh, okay.
But, you know, it was by a pile of rubbish, so it's kind of fair game, but
yeah,
that would have been ideal though. One of them was really big. So, mind you, they were rusting, so I'm not sure putting water in wouldn't have worked, actually.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, but I mean, people do use, I've got an old metal bath, you know, that people used to bathe their children.
I was thinking of that, a bath as well.
You know, that would work. Sinks like you're using, Larry, they would work. So there are a lot of different options, but the half barrels, I think, I agree with you, Teresa, I think they're really nice. And they can be bought, if you look online, there are companies that just sell them. But as I say, they do come very alcoholized. I don't think that's a word, but they come, you know, they're still quite whiffy. You know, definitely you can tell whether it was whiskey or wine.
Right.
As long as you can choose what the alcohol's been.
Yeah, there is that.
The frogs and tadpoles might get drunk.
It would.
It would, yeah.
And if you
Maybe
wanted,
you get extra singing.
if you wanted to create a reflection pond, how would you keep the water clear? Because in a reflection pond, you would not put any plants. It would just be a surface of water.
Yes, I'm not into reflection ponds myself, but basically you add some kind of chemical that means that then the surface looks glassy.
Yes.
So then you can see the reflection. But they aren't, I mean, I suppose this is kind of when this workshop says, you know, how to create your own or build your own pond, I'm really talking about a wildlife pond rather than a rill or, you know, something which is more decorative. You know, I'm not dead against that. It just seems a shame, really, given the lack of ponds in London, to then use a space where you've got water, you know, for that rather than for a wildlife pond, basically, because they're so beneficial.
And does that apply to having like a running water, a fountain, something like that? I don't think you mentioned that. Apologies.
That's really good. I mean, that will help aerate the pond. So having like a solar fountain is great in a pond, for example. That's a really good way to do it. And the pond, one of the ponds that you saw in the picture, that has a kind of waterfall. So you can create, if you've got the space, you can create just a simple waterfall with a pump where it, you know, you can just lead the water up through a kind of hose and pump it up, and then it'll just trickle down some rocks. I think that's really nice as well. You know, so there are different options, certainly having, and those would all be good for wildlife as well. You know, they're cool. That would all be great as well.
Thanks.
Cool. Great. Well, I think we're coming to the end of everyone's questions. Did anybody else have any final questions?
No, thanks.
No? Does that mean that it's been useful and I've answered answered what you kind of the queries and what have you that you came with?
Absolutely. It was very, very informative and very precise. I think I'm equipped to carry on with the pond.
Good. Excellent. All right then. Good. Well, I think that there'll be a mail out about the next events Eleri or Iris or Rish, did you want to say anything before we finish about what's on next? And is there a feedback form for people to fill in?
Yes, I'll send that straight away. So I've made a note of names, and I'll just send that after this session.
Great. Okay.
We do look at the feedback, and we particularly look at the suggestions for other workshops. So this has come out of suggestions for other workshops. It was one of the key ones that people were very interested in.
Yeah. Cool. It's also used, the feedback's used for the funders as well, because there are, funders who we need to report back to. Okay, cool. Well, I don't really want to say goodbye. It's nice seeing everybody. But I think we've come to the end of the session for tonight. So I will say goodbye to everyone. And thank you very much for coming. And it'd be good to have just a quick chat with you, Gillian, because I haven't.
Yes, so say we've got Saturday morning, haven't we?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got bee hotels and bees and things like that. Wildlife garden.
Lovely. It'll be fun.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very much. Thank you.
Right,
Bye.
Stay on for a minute then.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. How are you, Gillian?
I'm fine, thanks. Yeah, a bit busy, but okay. I had two webinars to go to at 6:30 today after a day of doing that kind of thing at my job. So, but yeah.
You had two what?
Webinars at 6:30 today that I could have gone to.
Right.
I picked this one rather than one for a school governor, which is also what I am.
Oh, okay.
But it'll all calm down. It sometimes goes like that. It's kind of nearly the end of term, and then everything, scouts and school will stop over the summer. So
Right, and then you can have a breather.
yeah.
Are you planning on going away?
I've got 2 weeks off, but I don't know whether I'll go away. See how things are, but probably just in the UK for